Hi, I'm Ethan Luckenbill, and this is my Microbial Communities project. I've titled it The Scientific Sourdough. Here's the introduction to my experiments. For my microbial community, I chose to use the sourdough starter. I conducted 3 different experiments using the starter. Each experiment served a different purpose and allowed me to gain a deeper understanding of the starter. I normally fed my starter once a week with 1 tablespoon of starter and 2 tablespoons of flour. I will be first going over experiment number 1. My introduction is that I put a container of starter in 2 different environments that differ in temperature. I then compared the pH of the different starters to see if temperature had an effect. My hypothesis is that a container of starter held in a colder environment will have a higher pH than a starter located in a warmer environment. For my methods, I compared the pH of a starter that was located in a fridge compared to a starter located outside of a fridge. I kept them in these different locations for 2 weeks, and after that time passed, I measured the pH of the 2 starters. The main control in this experiment was the starter held at room temperature. My goal in this experiment was to see if placing a starter in a colder environment will affect the pH, and this gave me something to compare it to. The main treatment in this experiment was the starter held in the fridge. By putting the starter in a cold environment, I was able to see how pH differs when compared to at room temperature. For my prediction, I thought that the container held in a cooler environment would have a higher pH than a starter located at room temperature. The reason for this was that pH often decreases with an increase in temperature. After completing the experiment, I found that the pH of the sourdough starter held at room temperature was 4, while the pH of the sourdough starter held in the fridge was 5. On the left shows the pH of the sourdough starter held at room temperature, while the one on the right shows the pH of the starter held in the fridge. For my conclusion, I found that the pH of a starter held in a cooler environment is higher than a starter held at room temperature. This shows me that the lower the temperature is, the higher the pH of the starter, which supports my hypothesis. Next, I'll be talking about my second experiment. For this experiment, I had 2 different starters, both placed in the fridge, and I gave them 2 different feeding schedules. I then compared the fungal growth to see if the feeding schedule had an effect. My hypothesis was that there would be a larger amount of fungal growth in a container of starter with a more frequent feeding schedule than a starter with a less frequent feeding schedule. The methods I used to conduct my experiment was that I placed 2 identical containers of starter in a fridge. I continued to feed one of my starters on my usual once a week basis, and then for the other jar, I did it more frequently and fed it once every 3 days instead. I then tested the fungal growth by swabbing the jars and putting it in the PDA with streptomycin. For the controls and treatments, the main control in this experiment was the starter fed on a normal feeding schedule, which was once a week. I needed something to compare a more frequent feeding schedule to, which this provided. The main treatment in this experiment was the starter fed on a more frequent schedule, in this case once every 3 days. I needed to see how a more frequent schedule compared to a normal feeding schedule when it came to fungal growth, which this provided. I predicted that there would be a larger amount of fungal growth in a container of starter with a more frequent feeding schedule than a starter with a less frequent feeding schedule. The more frequent feeding schedule would allow there to be more of the starter in the container, which I thought would lead to more fungal growth. After the experiment, I noticed that there was a similar amount of fungal growth in each petri dish. The starter with the normal feeding schedule had more colonies but less size of fungi. The starter with the more frequent schedule had less colonies, but the colonies were larger in size. The picture on the left depicts the petri dish with the normal feeding schedule, while the picture on the right depicts the petri dish of the more frequent feeding schedule. Based on the experiments, I don't believe that feeding schedule has much of an effect on fungal growth. Both had similar amounts of fungal growth, despite a difference in size of colony and amount of colonies, which does not support my hypothesis. Next, I'll be talking about my third experiment. For this experiment, I placed 2 starters in 2 different locations that differed in light. I then compared how each starter had risen to see if light had an effect. My hypothesis was that a starter would rise more when placed in an environment more exposed to light. To conduct this experiment, I placed one of the starters near a window while the other was located in a dark location in the same room. They each contained the same amount of starter and were on the same feeding schedule. Afterwards, I measured how much each of the starters had risen. The main control in this experiment was the starter held in the bright indirect light. I can compare this to the starter held in the darker environment to see if it has had an effect on how much it rose. The main treatment in this experiment was a starter held in the darker environment. By placing the starter in a dark environment and seeing how much it rose, I could compare it to the starter in the normal light, which was the objective of the experiment. My prediction was that the starter held in the normal light would rise more than the starter held in the dark. The reason for this is that sunlight often causes plants to grow compared to when in the dark, and I think that would apply to the starter as well. After 2 weeks, I noticed that the starter held in the regular light rose 1.5 centimeters, while the starter in the dark rose 1 centimeter. This is a picture of the two starters after the experiment concluded. The blue line indicates where the starter rose before the experiment, and this shows where it had risen to, with the left being the starter held in the light, while the right being the starter held in the dark. Based on the results, the experiment showed that the starter held in the darker environment rose less than the starter held in the normal light. This leads me to believe that the darker environment led the starter to rise less. But it is important to note that there was only half a centimeter difference between how much the two starters rose. The experiment still supported my hypothesis in that I believed that the starter held in the dark environment would rise less than the starter held in the normal light, which happened. But in the future, I would like to conduct the experiment again for a longer period of time to ensure that it was the amount of light that affected how much the starter rose. I cannot say this is conclusive, but I do think it is a good indication. The reason I think it is a good indication is because half a centimeter is a lot given the context of the experiment. Now on to the conclusion of all my experiments. Here's what I learned. From the first experiment that I did, I learned that the pH of a starter held in a cooler environment is higher than that of a starter held at room temperature. From my second experiment, I learned that feeding schedule doesn't have much of an effect on fungal growth. From my third experiment, I learned that a starter may rise more when placed in an environment exposed to more light, although it is not conclusive. In all, I found that these experiments helped me learn a lot about my starter. Some other ideas I had was that I could have tested if pouring a liquid other than water into the starter had an effect on it. Other than that, I found that I learned a lot from the experiments I conducted. That concludes my presentation. I have attached a lab report for each of the experiments that shows what I said in more detail. But that is it for my presentation. Thank you for listening.